Well, welcome back, and thanks for coming back, even after wandering around and sticking with us throughout the day. This morning, we introduced a bit of a framework around business expansion and business rejuvenation in other cities, about vision, business initiatives consistent with that vision, leveraging and creating enabling infrastructure to make it happen, and linking that with talent attraction and retention to follow through. I think we've heard a number of things that hit all of those elements through the other plenary panels this morning, and I was just going to grab a few things that struck me from the executive panel, the transformation panel, and the innovation panel. The executive panel, I think we heard that Houston and our leading companies have a tremendous amount of wherewithal, technical, engineering, ability to do scale projects, et cetera. We have a lot of initiatives underway that point at lower carbon. We think we have a branding issue. We heard some say that we're ready for a goal, and we're ready for a stretch goal. And we heard net zero carbon, we heard low carbon energy capital. Not universally, but some were willing to assert a goal, and a bold goal. In the transformation panel, I think there were some important mooses put on the table that, in fact, we have a huge challenge and a dual challenge because we've got to bring energy to a lot of people around the globe that don't have it, and we have to do it in a fundamentally cleaner way that's going to take a complete rewiring of the global system. And we don't have a branding challenge, we have an actual challenge. And there were some examples cited, such as marine fuels and cleaner marine fuels, and we're in a non-attainment area with a port. Its expansion is limited. We're not leading in that area. Shell's got a new energies division. The talent for that division, difficult to attract to Houston. They've based it in San Francisco. We ought to be thinking about that. So we have an actual challenge, not just a branding challenge. And those challenges beg leadership to help drive breakthroughs that are required to meet such ambitious challenges that drive dislocations and will require shaping priorities. So a call for leadership out of the transformation panel. The innovation panel echoed those challenges. It is a big challenge. It's an immense challenge. And there's a conundrum in there because innovation rarely comes quickly. There was a model that one of the panelists asserted. It's a combination of invention and translation, and it's that translation part that can take many decades. And so then the discussion turned to how do we bend that curve? And suggestions were, well, we need to focus. CCUS came out time and time again as almost a must-have by some of the panelists. Hydrogen was on the list. Methane detection was on the list. Second area was funding and ways to improve getting money to innovative technologies. And then the third was the incubation system and the linkage across startups, the major oils, universities, and other players to accelerate, again, the translation function. So those are just some of the things that struck me. And we've talked about some of these things among my panel. I just wanted to share that because some of my panel was in and out. I know some of you were in and out, but I'd like to kind of take those things as feedstock and again, as Brett said, kind of start to point that where's the path forward in Houston. So I'm going to run through real quick some introductions here of this panel. And I won't do them justice, just as I didn't do the rest of the day justice, but I'm going to try. So starting with Michael Skelly on my left, successful renewable energy and infrastructure entrepreneur. He's now a senior advisor at Lazard and advises investors on strategies in those areas, renewable energy, sustainability, infrastructure. He's been involved in multiple Houston infrastructure initiatives as well, including the successful bond campaign for Parks by You, which I appreciate as a biker because that one of the aspects of that is driving the bike trails around the bayous in Houston. Thank you for that. And I've got these slightly out of order. So Lara, Cottingham, Chief Sustainability Officer for Houston. She's the primary face to industry stakeholders, city council, and the media on sustainability topics. She's played a variety of previous communications media and advisory roles for Congress and congressional campaigns in the sustainability arena. We have Chuck. Chuck, you're kind of a jack of all trades, but currently executive director of University of Houston Carbon Management and Sustainability Program. Chuck previously was the Assistant Secretary of Energy responsible for fossil fuel strategic policy leadership, and preceding that he was in industry, 30 years in energy and energy technology companies. We got Bob. Bob Harvey, President and CEO of the Greater Houston Partnership, representative of the Greater Houston business community, serving as a convener and sounding board on key issues facing the community. And prior to that, Bob was EVP and Vice Chair of Reliant and serves on multiple not-for-profit boards in the Houston community area. He also happens to be a graduate of Texas A&M, which I need to call out because my wife, son, and daughter are all fellow former students of Texas A&M. And lastly, Pat Woods is also in that category. The former chairman of FERC and the Public Utility Commission here, and many times throughout the day. His accomplishments in creating such a transparent and effective power market have been cited, which we all appreciate. Pat holds leadership and has held leadership roles on a number of energy company boards, and currently focuses on new power system development, one of his roles being president of Hunt BEE. So we've got former regulator, we've got community leadership representative academia, city official, and successful entrepreneur. So we've got a nice cross-section of perspectives and experiences to help inform where do we go from here. And the way we thought about conducting the panel is around kind of four key questions. Where are we today? What advantages does Houston have to carry a low-carbon program forward? What obstacles do we have to overcome? And then a final, what should we do next? And so I'm just going to launch into those questions and start with where are we now in terms of the energy transition in Houston, some characterizations of that. And Michael, given you've done the hard work of getting from A to B and launching new companies, thought you'd be a great person to kind of help launch that dialogue.
So where are we today? Houston is, and this comes out of the, as we all know, Houston led in oil and then in natural gas, and then really beginning with Enron, led in electric power generation. And that sort of legacy created a good base for a number of companies to pop up in the early on in wind and now a little bit in solar. And I'd say, you know, Houston is in the top 5 cities in the country in terms of attraction of companies for wind energy. We're not nowhere in solar, but we have a very, very few solar companies and very few that with sort of national development organizations or asset deployment. We do, as we heard from EDF, we do quite well on the trading side of things. And then in terms of how we're positioned, I think we're, I'll start with the very positive, and then we'll come to some of the negatives later on in the panel. But we're really well positioned because at the end of the day, what renewable energy is about is harnessing low-grade forms of energy. And the great thing about oil and gas is it's super concentrated in lots of BTUs and a small, uranium's even better in this respect, it's very compact. But wind and solar are diffuse and gentle, and you need these massive gathering machines or apparati, and then you need a lot of infrastructure in terms of power lines to move it around. And a few blocks from here is Quanta Services. They're the biggest constructor of high voltage power. They have like 2/3 market share of high voltage power. Pat sits on the board. They're right here in Houston. It's logical for them to be in Houston. So we're actually pretty good at big projects, and to tap these diffuse forms of energy, you need that sort of expertise in financing and engineering and construction and land people and lawyers and so on. So we're nicely positioned. But that doesn't mean that we're certainly not winning in solar, and it does not mean we're going to win in wind. But we do have some of the ingredients.
Mm-hmm. Great. And Lara, how do you see it from a city perspective?
So first of all, thank you, Andy and KPMG and Brett, for making this day happen, because the fact that we're having this conversation here in Houston is so important.
And next year we'll call it a climate change.
So
for Ned's benefit.
He's stealing my thunder. But I was going to say, because I'm the city's chief sustainability officer, so a lot of people think my job is to single-handedly stop climate change, right? And it is my job, but it is also every single employee in the city of Houston and everyone in this room's job and everyone who lives in Houston. And to some extent, it's also everyone on the planet, right? This is a global problem, and we have to all work on this together, and that means events just like this. So really, thank you for making this happen. And to talk about where we are now from the city perspective, I think it's really important to talk a little bit about where we came from, and Jason Michelle talked about this really well earlier today, this question of, do we talk about climate or not in Houston? We're this oil and gas capital of the world, and you'll hear Mayor Turner talk about that all the time. It is a title that we are all proud of, but we are also, front and center for climate change. Two things happened within the past 2 years that really changed the way the city of Houston thinks about and talks about climate change. So the first one was 2 years ago, I think a couple of days ago actually, was the announcement of the withdrawal from the Paris Agreement, which had the impact overnight of cities and businesses all saying, declaring, #we're still in. That for whatever reason, I support the Paris Agreement and I want to do my part. And so you see now this waterfall effect across our country of businesses and cities doing climate action plans, getting involved. And someone said earlier, we needed a goal. We have a goal collectively. And it's going to be really hard because we as cities are trying to fill this void of this national agreement, right? If you talk about global temperature change, that requires every country on the planet to take part. When one of those backs out, you have a hole, and so we're trying to fill that. And it's a challenge for cities, right? But it's a challenge that we have said we have to pick up. And the second thing was Harvey, right? Now, it wasn't just Harvey. Those of you who are here in Houston know we flood frequently, but it was the Memorial Day flood, it was the Tax Day flood, and then it was Harvey, the largest rainfall event in North America. So in addition to having this kind of groundswell of support for cities taking action, you now have Houstonians who maybe never cared about climate change, maybe they don't believe in climate change. They are coming to every city council meeting, to every opportunity they have to let the mayor and city council members and all of their elected officials know, what are you doing to make sure that this doesn't keep happening and that we're prepared for the next big thing, right? And so that brings us to where we are today, where we went from a city that we talked about climate change very discreetly and respectfully. We tried and we do lead by example, and I can talk about the amazing things that City of Houston has done. We're the largest municipal user of renewable energy in the country, right? In terms of businesses, I think we're somewhere up there with Google and Starbucks. Our partners, NRG and NG, help us have a solar plant that's pretty small, relatively speaking, but it's about 12% of the city's usage. So that means the Houston Zoo, the Bush, one of the international terminals, some of our wastewater treatment plants, my office building, are all powered by solar, right? But the community might not necessarily know that. And we have more park space than any other city in the country, right? 40,000 acres, and we're one of the only cities that can actually grow that. We have a great transit system. We're doing a lot of exciting things in electric vehicles, but that's not enough, right? We went from this city where we talked about climate change occasionally to now we can't not talk talk about climate change. And if there's anyone who has questions about that, right, that's what we need to work on. We need to change that. It shouldn't be seen as political. It's not a good thing. It's not a bad thing. It's just our reality, right? Living in Houston, our climate has changed, and it's in everyone's best interest to work on that. And we have a goal that's been set. And the climate action plan that we'll talk more about is how, as a community, we can really tackle these goals. And it's also important to tackle them from a Houston perspective, because we're such a diverse and unique city, that it has to be built by our community.
Thanks, Lara. We will come back to the climate action plan. Chuck, you had, I think, some interesting perspectives on keeping in mind our role as energy capital of the world, defining what it means to move towards a low-carbon future.
Well, I mean, the conversations obviously all day have been about the transition that we're in, and we surely are. I think it's important to remember a couple of things as we talk about the transition. There's 14 states in this country that produce 80% of the energy for the country. There's makers and there's takers. And we're one of the makers. In fact, we're the biggest maker in a big way. And that responsibility is not going to go away. Consumers are going to continue to consume. And many consumers in places that don't make their own energy will be very open about their feelings about how we ought to be doing things here. But that doesn't get us away from the fact that from a leadership standpoint, we have an opportunity that's pretty unique. Not just in the United States, but really globally. Because this is a global issue. I mean, we all know that, we all recognize it, and many of the discussions today have been about options that we as a society can take. And those are interesting to a point, but when they start becoming uninteresting to me is when we talk about the choices that people in undeveloped countries don't have. And when you walk into that, you're walking into a situation where fossil fuels are not an evil, they're something that are necessary. The technology transformations that we all recognize are so important to the transformation are not only important, they're essential. And people in places in the world where populations are growing, they need energy in a big way. They're much further behind the curve. They need that leadership from us. Mm-hmm. And that's where I think Houston comes in terms of creating our city as a template for how we can incorporate all forms of energy using technology as a transformational tool. And I guess the only last thing I could add to that is it's so important to be able to utilize the whole ecosystem. And that's the industries that are going to lead with their own capacity and capabilities and scale to impact everything, certainly. The community that you just referenced and the awakening that we're all going through as a society, incredibly important. And I think if you look at any transformation that's occurred, it usually also occurs in a city that has a great relationship with the university. And you can take a look at California and the computer industry. You can look at Boston with the medical community. In some ways, you can look at Houston and the medical community as well. And you can take that model and you really look about energy and the energy transition, and that's why I think it's so incredibly important that we utilize Houston for everything that we have to be that template, that blueprint that can then be migrated globally. Because the global solution is the issue, not bits and pieces of things that we can do in our very comfortable, developed world that we live in, but really moving the needle in the places in the world that are the bigger contributors to the emissions, and how do we solve those problems?
Yeah. So I think this consensus, as we were all talking about this, is we've got some great start. We have some thought to do about the scope of our ambition. Yes, it's local, but recognizing our global role, and more work to do. I'd like to switch to the advantages about how we might parlay our strengths in carrying a program forward, and maybe Bob, if you could lead off with your perspectives on that.
Well, I would say, at the Greater Houston Partnership, perhaps our biggest responsibility as a business association is to position Houston to have a strong economy next year and 10 years from now and 30 years from now and 60 years from now. So we're very conscious of this issue of an energy transition and what it might mean for the Houston economy. We started bringing folks together a couple of years ago at the partnership specifically to talk about, is Houston as a business community taking the steps that we need to be taking to prepare for this low carbon future. And we were very pleased, frankly, to see how much activity was already here, kind of hidden behind the facade of these traditional energy companies that we might still tend to think of as simply oil and gas, but have already evolved towards this low carbon future. So the first insight we had is there was a lot happening here, but it wasn't being made very visible. It wasn't being integrated and coordinated and particularly supported within the community, but there's a lot here. As I think Michael Skelly mentioned, a lot of the traditional strengths of this city with respect to energy are going to be absolutely critical to this low carbon transition. So we have a role to play if we harness that strength. And Michael, you touched on the main elements of that, but we need to do that. And we need to make that visible, and we need to have a vision, and we need to lead and be seen as leading. And we need to deal with the fact that Houston throughout this process will likely be seen as perhaps not being totally committed when indeed we are. So I think we have a lot to bring. I think in the last 12 months, I've seen a great quickening of activity. It's become much more visible. I'm sure today we've talked a little bit about the CERA Week event that took place, a month ago, 6 weeks ago, and how just from one year to the next, this issue went from being largely in the background to being the foreground issue at that conference. So I think, and that was obviously with big oil present, midstream, big power, everyone was in the room acknowledging the importance of this issue. So let me just come back. I think as Houston, we have got to be seen, and we have the right to be seen if we take the right steps, to be seen as the leading contributor to this transition to a low carbon, zero carbon future. We have to organize ourselves to do that. And I think there's a role for all of us in the business community to make sure that happens in a highly visible, highly coordinated, highly supported way.
Pat, you have anything to add?
The only thing I would add, Andy, is the infrastructure, thinking back to the earlier conversation from the second panel about employment and education. We have a unique ecosystem here of people who started first as oil traders and then became, oil and liquids traders, then became gas traders, then became power traders. Then we traded all kind of, credits for sulfur dioxide, all the emissions and all. This is ground zero for that. Yeah, people in New York and London may want to do it, but it really goes on here. People move there, folks from Paris and Japan and all to come here to do that because this is where that is. Leveraging that into the new paradigm that's climate centered should not be a huge shift. So I think we can really take advantage of what, let's get some good root from what Enron did and let it revitalize the city. I think we can do that. And then the only other thing I would add, and it's really a Texas-wide thing, but it's what we did when Brett and I were at the PUC together. But we gently, at that stage, got the incumbent out of the way back then when the screaming and hollering, although it was pretty loud from HLMP, was muted compared to where it is in the rest of the nation now, so that the insurgents aren't so insurgent. There's room here. There's not the local opposition in place, at least on the power sector. Now I think on transport, we certainly have some of the vertically integrated oils and gas giants that are in varying stages of transitioning on this issue. But the electric industry has transitioned. And so what's nice is to get that out of the way. So I think that is an advantage here, and one that I don't think we've taken enough advantage of, that this is a great foundation with CenterPoint being the poles and wires company, but a great foundation for all that other innovation in the power sector, at least, to flourish.
Chuck, you mentioned a moment ago the role of universities in the ecosystem. Do you want to elaborate on that? I remember you mentioning some other cities who've taken better advantage perhaps than Houston's done to date.
Well, it starts with fundamental education at the grassroots level, and that could be, elementary schools and high schools even, just to have that energy message be very clear. But I think it gets to the point where students today want to work in companies that have a forward view, that are going to be part of the future that they want to be a part of. And so the workforce of the future is being developed as we sit here today. What are we offering them? What kinds of courses are we now preparing them with? That's all a big part of the educational program, but I would argue there's another one that may be even just as important, and that is the existing workforce today. When I got out of college, you had your degree, and that was good for the next 40 years. You were stamped and approved. I would argue that today, continuing education is a really important part of anyone's future. You've got to continue to reinvent yourself as you're moving along your curve in your career, at whatever stage you're in, to be relevant, to be impactful. And I think we've got an opportunity in that educational ecosystem as new circumstances like the low carbon future is part of the future. How do we educate people to be a part of it? What kind of new skills and capabilities are necessary? When I got out of college in 1977, we had 2 fellas that graduated with environmental engineering degrees. And we didn't even know what that was back in those days because it was such a new field. And today, I think you could look across the board and see how prevalent it is. And I think similar to that, you've got this carbon management capability that's going to require a lot of disciplines, a lot of capabilities, a lot of innovation, and working in the digital age that we're in, the oil field of the future, all of those things that Houston, again, on the cutting edge of all of that.
So maybe shift to what are the obstacles to overcome? And I'm going to start with you, Michael, because I know you've given that a lot of thought.
Yeah, so I think, there have been references throughout the day of we have Houston, we got this branding problem, like the brand is not quite right and so on. I think it's actually, and part of that is wait, this is an oil and gas city and they're going to go do all this renewable stuff, how's this going to work? I think it's actually more fundamental than that. And if you think of what is Houston? Okay, so it's a bunch of people living in one spot, but one cut at this is what's the role of the government? And in Houston, we have what many people would consider a deeply unsustainable land use policies. And the layout of this, infrastructure anywhere, infrastructure in Houston defines the city, and the city is defined by highways. And that's how we develop the city. We build, we widen I-10, we build the Grand Parkway, et cetera, often with public debt. So we have taken on many, many billions of dollars of debt to fund these highways. We're about to spend another $10 billion to expand I-45 with, big, that will have dramatic air quality impact in a city with non-attainment. And at the same time, we sort of struggle to figure out how do we fund other types of, well, actually we don't, we barely fund other types of transportation. And then we have city policies, sorry, Lara, that basically codify sprawl. So if you want to build, if you want to put in a bar and you got 20 bar stools, you have to have 25 parking spaces. So we say to people, we're happy to have you build a bar, but we want you to pave a bunch of area. And oh, by the way, we want you to drive to the bar. Okay, how's that for a great idea? And we presumably want you to drive home from the bar too. And then, oh, by the way, we're going to tax you for impervious surface at that bar. So some of this stuff is totally crazy, but we have a bunch of land use rules which were codified in the 50s when we were all sort of thought that this was the way to do things, and those rules still exist. And this applies to everything from street design to minimum lot sizes to all sorts of barriers to density. And, I think most of us can agree that post-Harvey, if anything, we don't want more sprawl. We'd like to densify a little bit. So at a minimum, let's get rid of the rules that prevent densification. And so that seems like super easy. None of those things cost money. All of those things would save a lot of money. But we continue to do them. And the land use patterns, we're not going to change them overnight, but the sort of mandated unsustainable land use model that we have would appear to fly in the face of sort of like thinking forward about sustainability and so on. So in terms of like what other things we could do about that, I mean, I think because of this issue, we have and there's these folks, there's leaders in this room, but we have a deep obligation to kind of go overboard in the other direction. And this is one of the reasons I've been excited about the stuff that we've done on the Bayou Greenways, which we think is fantastic, but it's actually quite small compared to what the cities that we compete with are doing. And so we have to go in really hard on other types of infrastructure, non-highways and big roads. Houston, unfortunately, we have a reputation for being not terribly friendly to, and some of this dates back to the battles over Uber and Lyft and so on, but we're not in the sort of shared mobility, new transportation world. Houston has a reputation for being fairly unfriendly to those new modalities. So we should lean in really hard on that. The work that we heard about from Centerpoint and Scott about vehicle electrification, we should go really hard on that. Again, this is sort of to sort of overcome this. When you go to the ballot box in November, if you can push the button for metro funding a couple of times, because we really, we got a lot of sort of ground to make up for. And then I think as many of the folks in the room are business people, but if you think about how the real estate decisions that you make as you site your businesses, if you look at the carbon impact of how people, of your sort of daily operations, a huge factor, and this really applies to offices. If you're manufacturing, you don't have so many choices. But if you have an office, you cannot claim to have a sustainable office unless you're downtown, because there's no way that people can get to and from the energy corridor if they, in a sustainable way on public transportation, if you're not downtown, because Metro simply can't serve such sprawled areas. Arguably, the Galleria kind of gets close, but these are really important decisions about what our city looks like, and if you're making business decisions about where to site yourself, you kind of have to take this stuff into consideration.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you. Now, I happen to know that Lara has thought about land use and other issues of that nature. Lara, your thoughts on things to overcome?
So in the list of challenges that we have, it's quite long. And Skelly hit on a lot of them. I think that you have to put all of this into perspective, that on one side we have someone talking about how we need more electric scooters. He really wants electric scooters, and very local issues, which are important. And then on the other side, we have someone who's saying that we need to be responsibly fueling developing and developed countries all over the world. And Houston is in the middle of both. And that's that unique part about Houston, right? And we have to fix both of these challenges. And from a city perspective, we're tied into this because we're kind of the face, we're what people think of when they think of Houston. But from a regulatory perspective, it's shared across a lot of different groups and entities, right? That we're a deregulated electricity market. So when we talk about, do we want more rooftop solar? Do we want just this, as a city to be 100% renewable or 100% anything? The city doesn't have that power, and we can't tell anyone what to do in that space. We have to just come up with an advertising campaign or something to convince businesses and residents, individual residents, to make that decision. Or we need to lobby the state to make a bigger renewable portfolio standard or something like that. And the same thing with Metro, right? The city has a voice, but not budgetary control. We don't have that ability. And so we try and advocate and we try and build around the idea of what we want Houston to look like, but then you overlay the state and the highways that are coming through, and you just keep piling these things on. And so from our office, we're really looking at, okay, where are the emissions coming from? What does the city have control over? What are the policies and strategies we could use to actually reduce them? And then what are the things that we have to say, this is someone else? Who is that person? How do you contact them or find them? And make sure that we build that communication or we let folks know. The zoning question comes up all the time, and it has been shot down famously.
No, by the way, I'm not saying zoning. I think I'm a libertarian on that stuff. So even less zoning than we have today.
You want less zoning?
Yes.
Except for land use rules.
Well, we have land use, we codify sprawl. We don't have zoning per se, but we have codification of sprawl, which is
we're a picky
even worse.
People, right? We want some things, we don't want other things. But Houston has grown so quickly, and we grow in spurts, right? And so with all of our flooding issues, with our traffic congestion issues, with air quality issues, you see that it happens as more people come to our community, right? In terms of greenhouse gas emissions, we are potentially the largest of cities in the United States. Almost half of that comes from just transportation, right? 33 billion vehicle miles traveled every year in the city of Houston. And so that's a really good snapshot of the equivalent of 177 trips to the sun and back, right? Of people in cars. And so we have to think about talking the talk and walking the walk.
I'll write that down.
If you are a company, doesn't matter what you do, if you're in energy, if you're not in energy, if you are and you're a solar company, but you're based out on the energy corridor, I-10, wherever, how are you working to get those vehicle miles traveled down? What are you doing? Every little bit has a component to it. And I think that we talk really, really high level, and then we talk really, really low level. And bringing those together and figuring out what are the programs that actually work, and then building them and making them happen is really important right now, because everyone agrees we need to do something. We need to figure out what that is, and we need to actually do it, right?
Thanks, Laura. So range of complexities, locally, overlay of the Houston role globally. Pat, not going to ask you to reconcile all that on the fly. However, I thought you had some interesting perspectives on maybe call it from an organizational standpoint. How do you cope with such complexity and work towards productive change?
You know, in opening up the power system in Texas, which was a century-old monopoly at the time, it was it would not have happened without the large coalition that came around behind it. And it was not a comprehensive coalition. Residential consumers were not very agitating at all for any change to the paradigm. But the large industrials, primarily the ones who live in this area code, down on the Houston Ship Channel, were extremely strong. They wanted to cut their own deals. Bob G. and I were on the commission when the last of the special contract prices for Houston Lighting and Power were put before us, and the ALJ recommended that instead of building a new power plant to serve them, HLMP should let its customers shop around. That was kind of the beginning. That was before I got there, but Bob, you were chairman then. The beginning of that was getting that coalition to lobby for full comprehensive choice for everybody. We didn't allow the utilities to buy off the industrial. So it was a little tug of war, but I mean, the governor who appointed me, Governor Bush, was pretty clear about his agenda, so that was my job to implement it. It's a little easier to do it when it was a one industry with one regulator deal. I mean, I think the point Laura points out is who's got the power levers here to make this one happen? We've got to be cleverer enough to do that, but recognize that it's got to be a comprehensive, across-the-board type coalition that really takes charge of this. And, you know, an event like this will be looked back at, you know, we had an event, we called it the February conference, but we had an event, this will be that event, possibly, that becomes that catalyst for Houston to just take charge of this and say, we're going to build coalitions across people in this room and a lot of people who aren't in this room yet to make that happen.
You know, the partnership has an energy subcommittee, and that's one of the topics that Bob has really championed on behalf of the city. I'm fortunate to be a part of that, CCUS being a part of that energy subcommittee. And the concepts that we're throwing out, just as an idea, is to be able for many of these energy companies who themselves said, look, this is a market-driven situation. It's not a government regulation following mode, but in fact getting ahead of the curve. How do I make products that are low carbon, that are differentiated in a global market, that I can sell perhaps at a premium over something else? How do I make this an accretive way to further the interests of not only my company, my shareholders, my employees? I'm doing it because I want to get out ahead of a curve and be able to capture competitive advantage on a global basis. That, to me, is the essence of what the partnership is trying to sponsor, and what we have the ability to do in our, if you will, economic development zone of the Houston Ship Channel, to be able to create circumstances where companies can begin to create those products and services that are differentiated on a global basis. I can get paid more for them, I can make money, and I can do it because it makes sense, not because somebody in Washington's telling me to do something.
Really resonates, Houston way. We're just about at time. I think we're just slightly over time, but Brett, if it's okay, I'd just like to get 2 or 3 sentences from each of you, recommendation on path forward, and maybe go with Bob first.
Maybe picking up on Chuck's comment, this city has the opportunity to be the global leader in developing and applying the technology that's going to create a solution to a problem that we've created throughout the industrial age. But we have the opportunity to be that community, that business community, that broad community that applies itself to this problem in a way that no other community in the world will do. We have the skills, we have the intent, we have the access to capital, we have all the things we need to be the leader in solving this problem. I think what we haven't yet done is really commit ourselves as a community to that task. But I think we're right on the cusp of that. And if we do that, then I think it'll be both to our economic benefit, because we will be positioned well for this transition, and it'll be for our community and global benefit. So I think that's where we are. We're just right at the cusp. Just like you said, that February conference, this is that moment when Houston can stand up and say, that's the role we intend to take.
Terrific, thank you. Chuck, did you have anything to add?
No, there's no point in shedding light where there's no darkness. Shed it all.
That's a great one.
Yes.
Laura?
I would say that on a global scale, the world is watching Houston, right? We are the oil and gas and energy capital of the world, and we have one of the largest climate events. So everyone wants to know, what's Houston going to do, right? How is our industry going to move forward, and how is our city going to move forward? And I think everyone today has talked about how we want to. So the pressure is on for us to actually act, and for everyone to remember that it can't happen in a vacuum, right? Everyone, every step of that chain on the local level and the industrial level has to be involved. And that's not easy to do, but I think that's absolutely something we can do.
Michael?
So coming back to the branding issue, what people look for in a brand is something that's internally consistent, okay? So what we want to do is we should try to find every example that we can on the planet that can create consistency around what we want to be. So think about the Port of Houston. Why is it that Singapore, okay, has electrified their port and we have not? I mean, that just doesn't make any sense. We've got the cheapest power. I assure you our power is cheaper than their power. Think about what has LA done to tackle their transportation challenges in terms of, serious investments in public transportation. Think about what Minneapolis, where 6 months out of the year it's pretty inhospitable. What have they done to create, at a very low cost, the ability to get around town without getting into a car? So find all these examples. Everybody else in the country and in the world, they're trying to figure this thing out. And there's a lot of great examples for us. We should bring them to Houston, try to make them happen here, and that will create internal consistency around, this sort of vision of Houston 2.0.
Excellent. Pat, any final words from you?
This state led on the last revolution for a subset of what we're talking about here. We can do it again. We did it, but we've got to do it. And I was happy to see that great apostle for optimism at lunch. Amory Lovins, before I really knew him, I thought, oh, he's one of those other guys from the left side of the world. I'm not going to have anything interesting for me to hear. Boy, was I wrong. And 20 years later, he just slammed it home today, giving us a lot of optimism about the ways that Texas can do what it does best, which is make money off of what God gave us. He gave us a lot of stuff that we pulled out of the ground in the 20th century that we learned how to make money off of. And now in the 21st century, we can learn how to make money off of what comes from above the ground and everything else. And we're uniquely good at that. But if we don't embrace that paradigm early and get out in front of it with market-driven innovation leading the way, as opposed to top-down policy/government being shoved down our throats, which will happen if we don't do it. One of these elections, it's going to swing and it will happen. We see it bubbling here and there. If we can lead the way, say, hey, we want to get there in a apolitical way that's driven by markets and by innovation, we will be superior in timing, we'll be superior in price, and most importantly, a market-driven innovation outcome will be one that is superior in results, and that's what we really want for our kids. So let Houston be the nameplate for that place.
Terrific.
What a great panel. Well, you guys nailed it. So here's the takeaways from the day, at least mine. We need to talk about climate. That's clear. We need to have a stretch goal. We need to leverage our strengths. We need to build this coalition of the willing. We need to have pilots and examples. If we can't do CCS here, where are we going to do it? And finally, and that markets matter, and that this can be done through innovation, something that we, and that we have an advantage in. And finally, that this is the beginning, not the end of the conversation. That this is our moment. That this could be that watershed for which we start to address climate and make Houston not only a leader locally, but globally in solving this huge challenge. So I want to thank you guys for sticking it out today. I have a few people to thank. I want to thank Amanda Duda and Stephen Scarborough. Where are they? Not there. They are in the back.
Yeah, thank you.
And Laura Goldberg and Betsy Breyer over here, who have been my partners and inspirations in this work. And Russell Richard, who runs our leadership program and who does a great job on that. And I would be remiss if I didn't plug the leadership program. If you're interested in learning about that, see one of us after. I don't think Russell is here right now, but that's the other thing that we do. We do this amazing leadership program. We'd love to have all of you guys involved. Finally, we have a reception right across the hall. James Calloway has graciously agreed to buy us all drinks. And so I hope you'll join us for the reception and continue the discussion. Thanks very much.
Thank you.